For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Motshabi Hoaeane. Researcher and analyst Professor Raymond Suttner discusses former President Nelson Mandela's experiences as a political prisoner. Thank you so much for your time, Professor. In your column, you refer to two very different phases of Nelson Mandela's life, his early prison period and his negotiations. What can we learn from these?
What I was trying to do, and what I'm trying to do in all that I'm writing or saying about Mandela, is to open up discussion, because too often Nelson Mandela is described as a global icon, and one doesn't appreciate that Mandela changed a lot during his life. And the Mandela who went to jail was a fairly impetuous person. He had often been reprimanded for saying things that were not policy of the ANC. He had been a boxer. He had been a man about town driving a fancy Oldsmobile, and compared with Sisulu and Tambo, he used to dress very differently. He was very flashy dresser. So this combination of fancy car, boxer, and fancy clothes was very similar to the appeal that Tsotsis used to have in the township. So there was something about Mandela that was very different from the others. A little bit of a showman in his court appearance, for example. He would treat the court as an arena where he would sort of be quite demonstrative in the way he handled his cases. So we see Mandela coming in 1941 to the Witwatersrand as something of a country hick. But even then, while he was vulnerable as a country hick, Albertina Sisulu was worried that he would be recruited by one of the gangs of Tsotsis because of what she said, she referred to as his aggression. Because Mandela grew up in a part of the Transkei which prized warrior masculinity. So when he came to the Rand, his idea of being a man was tied to toughness. So there was always this side of Mandela. Now, when the Youth League was founded, people in the Youth League were hostile to working with the Indian Congresses and the Communist Party, and they used to break up their meetings. Mandela was much more extreme than the others in breaking up these meetings. And he continued long after Sisulu and Tambo had stopped doing it. So I think the relationship with Sisulu was very important in tempering the passion of Mandela even before he went to jail. But we can see in the Rivonia speech, there's a great dignity in the way Mandela presented himself. Now, that dignity, that sense of being at peace with himself was something that I think grew in the period in prison. Nelson Mandela, when he's asked by the person who collaborated with him on his autobiography, Richard Stengel, what was the effect of prison, he says, I matured in prison. Now, what happened in prison is that Mandela lost the sense of impatience. He had a lot of time for everyone else, would listen to people's life histories, would help them with their studies and their court cases and things like this. So by the time that Mandela initiated his talks with the government, he was a very different person from the man who went to jail. He was waiting, ready to take his time. He recognized that there was a possibility for talks, but the way he entered that was as a much more mature, rounded person than the young man who went to jail in 1964.
Now, Professor, you say your treatment of Mandela initiating talks is ambiguous because now he acted individually without any mandate. Please elaborate on this.
Well, you know, in the ANC and many other organizations, you act collectively. Now, Mandela himself says that he placed a lot of value on acting collectively. In other words, you don't do things on your own. You have to have the consent of the other members of the organization, if you're in the leadership, the other leaders. And in prison, for example, even if I needed something urgently, I couldn't on my own approach the officer and ask for it. Because for all I knew, what I wanted to do could have an adverse effect on others in the community, prison community. So we used to consult. We used to have mechanisms for ensuring that everyone was consulted before we approached the authorities about something. Now, the same goes for all organizations, in fact, not just the ANC and its allies. You don't have the DA caucus making a decision, then someone just going and doing what they like. But Mandela has a record from his youth of doing things outside the collective. In the Sophia Town removals, this is long before the ANC had decided on armed struggle, he led the crowd in a song which was really an incitement, so he was reprimanded. In 1961, before they decided on Umkhonto we Sizwe, he told a British journalist, if they continue to practice violence, we will have to reconsider our stance. And he said, the chapter of non-violence has been closed. And he was reprimanded for this. Now, characteristically, Mandela in Long Walk to Freedom, even though he apologized then, says he was right. Because sometimes he says it is important for a leader to nudge along the others. So while he commended collective action to others, and in fact, he went down to the Eastern Cape once to tell a man, Gwenche, that he should be operating in the collective, and all sorts of actions against others. Very often Mandela did break the collective. In the particular case of opening the talks, what I tried to show in that article is that here is Mandela reading the situation in a particular way. He is isolated from everyone else. He believes that he has the opportunity to start a conversation with the apartheid regime. This conversation, he believes, may break the deadlock. There was a deadlock because the ANC was not able to defeat the apartheid regime. The apartheid regime was not able to secure governability to stop the protests. It's what Antonio Gramsci calls a reciprocal siege. Now, Mandela took this opportunity, consciously doing it without getting consent. And in some ways, it was outrageous, because as he said, he wanted to present them with a fait accompli. In some ways, it was outrageous, but Mandela says leaders have to lead. So the way I concluded that article was to ask, must we absolutize collectivism and say under every circumstance it is applicable, or can we possibly consider this as a legitimate departure, given in retrospect that it did open the way for what became a democratic constitution?
Thank you so much, Professor, for your insights. That was Professor Raymond Suttner on Nelson Mandela as an agent of change and his efforts to create conditions for talks between the apartheid regime and the ANC.